Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Closed by Mo. My name is Mohammed. You guys can call me Mo. I'm hopefully your favorite YouTube host on most things real estate in New York City. In this week's episode, we're going to cover more about the different rental fees and laws that you need to be aware of if you're living in New York City. I don't care if you're a landlord, if you're a tenant, if you're an experienced investor or a newbie investor. These rental fees and laws apply to everyone, especially after the passing of the 2019 Tenant Protection Act. So without further ado, let's jump right into the nitty-gritty and the meat of this video. Alright, so I can't talk about the rental fees and laws and regulations in New York City without touching on probably one of the bigger talking points here, that is the security deposit limitations. Now, after the 2019 Tenant Protection Act was passed, there was a lot of, I would say, caps put into place for different fees that landlords and brokers could have charged. To begin with is a security deposit limitation. Now, what I mean by that is before 2019, landlords could charge first month's rent, security deposit, and last month's rent, and on top of that, the tenant would have to be responsible for the broker's fee. So that's a lot of money that the tenant or tenant's family would have to pay upfront just to secure an apartment. And of course, after the 2019 Tenant Protection Act was put into place, we start to see that those fees curve down a little bit. What I mean by that is now landlords cannot charge more than first month's rent and the security deposit when a tenant is signing the lease. The broker fee is completely separate that the tenant would still be responsible for, depending on the market and the listing agreement. But the landlords are not allowed to charge more than 1 month's rent value on the security deposit itself, meaning all you have to pay as a tenant to the landlord is now capped at first month's rent and the security deposit. A couple of other fees that you should probably know about, especially if you're buying, selling, or renting in New York City or even investing, is that the application fees are also now capped after the 2019 Tenant Protection Act was put into place. What I mean by that is before 2019, if you're applying for a house or an apartment to rent, the application fee could be whatever it wanted to be, right? However, now it's capped at $20 per application, meaning if you're the tenant and you're applying to an apartment, you're not expected to pay more than $20 for that application fee. And if you're a landlord or a broker and you're using a screening service or a rental application service, and the fee is $50, you can't pass on that cost to your tenant anymore. The tenant can and should only be paying $20 of that $50. The remaining should be coming out of the landlord or the broker's pocket, depending on whatever kind of agreement the broker has with the landlord, if there is even a broker put into place. A third thing to also keep in mind is about broker's fees. Now, you might be a little bit weirded out to know is that there are no limitations on broker's fees in New York City when it comes to the rental market. What I mean by that is if the landlord and the listing agent have a agreement in place where the tenant is going to be responsible for $1 million in broker fees, that's completely above board. That is totally fine because that agreement has been put into place, and that's not something that is actually illegal at all. However, the one thing I would say though is most brokers in New York City, because they understand the market and they know that most of the market is doing this, is that tenants or usually the broker's fee is usually paid by the tenants, and the tenant will pay around 1 month's rental value for the broker fees itself, and the broker's fee is usually split between how many other brokers are involved in that transaction. One other thing to also keep in mind is sometimes brokers might charge a percentage of the overall annual lease amount towards their broker fee. What I've seen in my experience is usually that'll amount to very close to a full month's rent, either a little bit more or a little bit less, but it doesn't really fluctuate too much. A couple other things to also keep in mind is things with late fees. Now, prior to 2019, landlords could charge penalties and fees on top of their late fee itself, which made it very difficult for tenants to sort of climb out of that hole to catch up with their rental amount, right? However, after the 2019 Tenant Protection Act was passed, landlords are now capped at charging a late fee of no more than $50. Meaning, even if you're late by your rent by like 20 days, 30 days, or even a couple of months rent late, the monthly late fee is now $50 capped. It's not like a percentage of the overall lease amount or anything. It's capped at $50. Now, a couple of other things to also keep in mind that aren't necessarily related to the rental fees itself have to actually do with the rental amount. Now, what you have to understand is if you're living in a market rent unit, meaning it's not rent regulated, it's not rent stabilized, the landlord has complete control over how much they can increase that rent. There are no laws, no regulations preventing the landlord from increasing the rent 100% year over year. Now, will that unit be rented? Because if the landlord is charging way above market rent, most likely no one's going to want to rent there, but they're absolutely allowed to do it. There's no regulations against it. Unless you're living in a rent stabilized or rent controlled unit, the landlord has full control over how much they want to charge the rent or how much they want to list their unit for. Doesn't mean it's going to get rented for that, but just so you know, if it's a free market rent, the landlord has absolutely full control over it. If it is a rent stabilized or rent controlled unit, then basically any rental amount that's being charged has to get approved through the New York City Rental Guidelines Board. Any rental increases are also capped and usually have to get approved through the guideline boards themselves too. A couple other quick things to also keep in mind. Most New York City landlords aren't super excited about the prospect of a tenant subletting or assigning their lease to someone else. Even though if you're the one subletting it, or if you're the one, that's the original leaseholder and you want to sublet it to someone else because you're going to be gone for a few months in the summer or whatever it is, you're still going to be responsible. Most landlords aren't super okay with a stranger coming into their place unless you have a good relationship with your landlord and maybe they know the new tenant. That's something I've seen as in a very case-by-case basis. A couple other quick things to keep in mind from a tenant's perspective is once you sign the lease with the landlord, within 30 days they have to give you a copy of that signed lease. They also have to give you a let pamphlet, let disclosure, and once you are moving on and that lease has ended, the landlord has 14 days to give you back your security deposit, minus any deductions that they may have done. And if there are any deductions made, then those deductions have to be itemized so you see exactly what was charged and how much that cost is. So at least you have a record of everything to know that you're not getting overcharged or you're losing out on your security deposit for no reason whatsoever. So the more you guys know, I hope you really enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making it, and I definitely learned a couple of quick things too. If there's anything that's specific that you want me to do a little bit more research about or look into a little bit further, please let me know in the comment section below. All my information is below too. I'll see you guys next week.